Okay, so we now move on to the impact of collateral part, and this is a small chapter. We'll look at quantifying counterparty credit risk and the impact of collateral in this section. So taking collateral into account when putting a value on credit exposure is something that we need to understand. Knowing the impact of certain conditions such as threshold, minimum transfer amount is important for understanding the role that collateral plays in quantifying exposure. Additionally, what we are looking here is to understand the remargin period and what comprises of actual period when talking about collateral transfer into consideration. And finally, an understanding of potential risk that may occur with entering into collateral agreement, how to manage this research into well-functioning of collateral management process. So how to manage collateral, what does collateral adds or do is the main thing that we are going to look here. So impact of collateral on credit exposure. When party A has a positive collateral exposure, that is it receives cash in a swap transaction for party B. Party A is said to have credit exposure since party B could default. When exposure mark to market is default, party B must post a collateral and party A to minimize the credit risk. When calculating an exposure profile, risk manager should understand that the factors that affect the collateral ability to reduce risk, specifically factors that affect the calculation of exposure, include threshold, minimum transfer amount, rounding independent amount, and remargining period. And these are the factors that we are going to look at. So just repeat for you those things. The factors that affect the calculation of collateral is threshold, minimum transfer amount, rounding, and independent amount, and the remargining period. So remargin period, also known as margin call frequency, is the period for which a collateral call take place when collateral is actually delivered. It is period of extreme exposure to the counterparty seeking collateral when prudent risk analysts will assume the default of other counterparty risks. Steps that enter into the calculation of number of days in remargin period are listed below. When they are like step 1, which is valuation on margin call, receiving collateral, settlement, grace period, and liquidation, closeout, and rehedge. So valuation on margin call. This is again the steps that are needed to enter into calculation of number of days in the remargin call period. So valuation on margin call are the terms or the days or the duration of how long it takes to calculate current exposure to counterparty and market value of the collateral. This calculation helps to determine if a valid call may be made. Then we have the receiving collateral, is the period when counterparty receives the request and when it releases the collateral. Then we have the settlement, the time takes to settle the collateral for cash. This type of security being settled determines the time necessary. Cash may be posted on intraday basis, whereas government corporate bond may be read once and 3-day settlement period respectively. And what's the grace period? It's the amount of time afforded to the counterparty obligated to deliver collateral in the event that collateral is not received by the requesting party after the call. This may be short window for time before delivering counterparty for considered default for what's known as failure to pay credit event. And what's liquidation and closeout and rehedge? The time needed to liquidate the collateral, close out, and rehedge the position. An example of margin period time is found in figure. That figure is comprised of the remargin time period. So it would be like the figures here would look like 2 days for valuation margin call, 1 day for receiving collateral, 2 days for settlement, 3 days for grace period, and 2 days for liquidation, closeout, and rehedge. So this is how things are made up. So length of margin call could vary as a function of collateral agreement, the counterparty in question, legal concern, other management structure. Also, the requesting counterparty could show leniency towards certain counterparty in interest to maintaining harmonious business relation. Now, how do we measure the exposure during the remargin period? So we need to understand the calculation of the expected exposure and potential future exposure over the remargining period given a normal distribution assumption. Both expected exposure and potential future exposure measure the volatility of exposure over a given amount of time. Expected exposure is the expected value of exposure at a given amount of time. During remargin period, it is calculated as 1 upon 2 pi into volatility of collateralized exposure into remaining remargin frequency in years, and we divide that. So the equation becomes 0.4 into volatility of collateralized period into root of remaining frequency, and remaining frequency is in years. And potential future exposure is what the value of the mark to margin exposure might be at some point of time in future during the period. It's calculated as K into sigma E into the time period, and the sigma is again the volatility of the collateralized exposure into time. So what we are doing here is that the expected exposure we are trying to get the value at the exposure, and we are looking at volatility of the collateralized exposure, what's happening with the prices of that, and remaining frequency in years, so that we can tone it down. Do you remember in the first FRM part 1 we use root T to bring down something that's related to volatility? We are exactly doing the same thing here. So volatility of collateral exposure into root of TM, which is the remaining time frequency in years. So that's in years. And the same way we calculate potential future exposure. So K is a constant that is a function of confidence interval, that's 2.33 for 99%. So don't worry about 1 upon root 2 pi. It's nothing but the same normal distribution terms that we often see. So if you want to calculate the worst case charge in the value of exposure with 7% annual volatility and collateralized by cash, and we assume a 250 days trading period, 99% of confidence interval, then we'll use 2.33 into volatility into the days. So that would be the worst case change in the value of collateral. It's all like when somebody has given you a collateral and you are just looking at how the prices of that collateral would rise up and down over the given period, and you take things from there. So potential disadvantage of PPE calculation are 5. The first is it assumes strong collateral position. It fails to work under large threshold or minimum transfer amount. It fails to account for uncertainty of collateral volatility. Liquidation and liquidation risk are not considered. Volatility may differ from expected implied period. Collateral called wrong way risk is not taken into account. So these are all risks that are still not taken, and we must remember the way in which they model the collateral losses was based on simple normal distribution. Neither we take an account how are we going to sell it and so on. So calculating collateral velocity occurs when non-cash collateral to be accounted for, because its decline in value could lead to under collateralization. The same PP formula is used, and the overall volatility when there is no correlation between volatility of underlying is the variance of non-cash collateral plus variance of underlying exposure. For example, if volatility of non-cash collateral was 8% and the volatility of underlying exposure was 5%, the volatility could be root of both of them. So that's how we calculate it. So just understand that variance of non-cash collateral and variance of underlying exposure, and we have to calculate them. If they are not correlated, then we have to just square them and add them. The volatility measure would be used in PFE formula to reflect the relative exposure of the collateral and volatility of the underlying exposure. In this example, collateral lessen the exposure but increase the volatility of position due to volatility in the collateral itself. There is also a situation where a negative position correlation P between the trade and the collateral. For example, if you assume a 10-year swap in collateral with 15 years of government bond, that is interest rate sensitive, the volatilities are 4% of the swap and 6% for the bond. And if we have got this correlated, then we'll find out the effective volatility. Then effective volatility, then we'll multiply with K and root of TM. So again the same thing, just to find out the effective volatility, which is the old formula of calculating the volatility using the covariances and things like that, and just getting them down to finding what could be the value of the overall risk in the position of the collateral. Then we have modeling collateral as the next heading. So describing the assumption and parametric involved in modeling collateral becomes very important. Quantifying how much collateral reduces credit exposure is important. That risk arises during the process of collateral exposure. Collateral may be defined may be deficient due to terms in the collateral agreement such as threshold, minimum transfer amount, rounding. These factors may result in less than full collateralization. So exposure should be greater than collateral, and exposure could increase between the margin call. The increased amount of exposure may not be collateralized. The following expression, which is the exposure of T and T minus delta. Collateral is path independent. This means that the amount of collateral requested depends on how much was requested in the past. Now certain parameters impact the effectiveness of collateral in less credited exposure, and these parameters are 5. They are remargin period, threshold, minimum transfer amount, independent amount, and rounding. Remargin period is the time between call for collateral and its receipt. Threshold exposure level below which the collateral is not called. Minimum transfer amount is the minimum quantity or the block in which collateral may be transferred. Independent amount is an amount posted independently of any subsequent collateralization. This is referred to as initial margin. Rounding, the process by which collateral amount will be adjusted to a certain amount. So what are the determinants of collateralization is now important to us, and figuring out how much exposure should be collateralized at a given point in time. So remargin call period, calculation of collateral called or written, calculation of collateral exposure in each point in time are three things that we need to consider to find out the collateralization. We now move to the impact of collateral models on exposure profile. So the impact that each factors of collateral modeling has on exposure profile, starting from a simple case to a full collateralization, is very important here. The scenario that illustrates the risk of collateralization with positive or negative values could be a positive mark-to-market exposure or negative mark-to-market exposure. In a scenario with significant positive mark-to-market, collateral helps to mitigate exposure. As the exposure decreases, collateral is returned and to the appropriate counterparty. Assuming a value of transfer amount is given, a small amount of whole collateral would result. Negative mark-to-market exposure in the scenario with significant negative collateral exposure increases the risk when posted to the counterparty. Once MTM exposure begin to increase, collateral should be returned. The minimum transfer amount is in a small amount of under collateralization. So both positive and negative mark-to-market in that scenario, both significant positive and negative mark-to-market exposure over the life of the swap. In that case, collateralization may be debatable. Collateralization may reduce and increase risk in the process. Collateralization does, however, simplify modeling exercise, serves to convert long-term risk into short-term risk. The following cases introduces minimum transfer amount and threshold into collateralized modeling. For each case, we'll illustrate the impact of expected exposure and potential expected exposure or potential future exposure. So the expected exposure and potential exposure both uses the same formula, that is a constant into the volatility into root of time period. So inclusion of minimum transfer amount for expected exposure, logic dictates that positive MTM about half of the time and that average exposure equals half of MTS. So for the PFE, the worst case scenario is the exposure moving into full MTM amount. Exposure assumes either a major move or MTM or exposure just below the MTM amount, but does not both. For this reason, collateralization is greater of the two amounts, and those two amounts are expected exposure and 0.25 into MTA, that's the minimum transfer amount, and the same goes for PFE, which is max of PFE and MTA. So inclusion of threshold are designed to strike balance between acceptable exposure and manageable operation workload. Exposure at T is nearly equal to exposure at T plus a threshold. So approximate value of expected exposure after including threshold is what we have to calculate. Now we move to collateral agreement risk and look at the relevant risks involved in resulting entering into collateral agreement. Collateralization may improve asset recovery in the event of counterparty defaults. One should view it as a proposition to but not replacement for ongoing due diligence review of credit quality and exposure. Use of collateral may be viewed as double-edged sword. When properly marginized, it can mitigate risk. When managed poorly, it will give risk to additional risk. So risk that collateral could pertain are discussed below. Operation risk, potential pitfall in handling of collateral and missed collateral calls, failed delivery, computer error, human error, fraud. So these are the potential pitfall. Poor control must proper control must be in place to reduce the likelihood of occurrence of any one of these risks. An example of proper control would be existence of accurate and enforceable legal agreement, robust IT system capable of automation of many steps, and so on. So default risk, the default of a security post-access collateral will lower its value when loss is in value is unlikely to be recovered by a haircut. Cash or high quality fixed income asset are usually preferred types of collateral. Should the collateral rating fall below that of a collateral agreement, then it would be needed to be replaced. Poorer collateral would fall to mitigate counterparty risk. Foreign exchange risk occurs when counterparty has different currencies, and liquidation risk occurs when there would be transaction costs that have to be bear to liquidate the collateral. So they are often in the form of beta spread or selling cost. Liquidation securities amount liquid security is the amount that is large relative to typical trading volume and negatively impact price, leading to substantial loss. The alternative to liquidation is a position more slowly and with that approach the counterparty is exposed to market volatility during the period of liquidation. So that was it about the collateral management, and I'll just repeat some important points for you. So the counterparty that receives collateral has positive MTM exposure. The counterparty that posts collateral has negative MTM exposure. So the factors that affect the calculation of exposure are remargining period, minimum transfer amount, threshold, independent amount, and rounding. So that was all about the collateral management. I hope it added something to your consisting knowledge base. Thank you for listening, and I'll join you back soon.